So thank you, Kent, and welcome everyone to this evening. I'm going to go deep time on you in 5 slides and try to cover the archaeology of fermentation. In the meantime, you'll be able to come up here afterwards, and I know Casey's adjusting some lights. You can see the fermentation cycle here of basically grain to glass. This is recycled from the reason why really I came to Green Bay to become a curator at the Neville was to curate an exhibit called we ended up calling it Agriculture to Tavern Culture, the art, history, and science of beer. So Dennis Stroslanik, who's I think around tonight, maybe still or just left, did the graphic design. He's now still with us. It's great. Photographs down here are from the collection. You can actually go and browse those on our website, nevillepublicmuseum.org, if you're wondering. So with that, Casey, if you want to drop that, lights on the stage, and we'll go deep time. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, 15 minutes. I'm seeing 25 past the hour. 25 past the hour, that's what I'm seeing. What you're seeing here in the background is the drinking scene, predecessor to the symposium. Who's ever heard of a symposium? Well, some hands, great. Not a conference that maybe you go to that covers a few topics. This is a drinking ceremony, feasting. In the Greek word symposium, this is actually predecessor to that. This is from a lapis lazuli bead, the size of your little finger, rolled. Lapis lazuli is a very fine stone, and you roll it out on clay. And what you're seeing is this was found inside the burial chamber of Queen Puabi, which was in modern-day Iraq. It's 5,000 years old, and they're drinking out of straws in these ceramic vessels. And so that's just the introduction. There's so many sites you could go around the world and talk about the archaeology of alcohol, but I'm going to share just some of the highlights. I mean, so you got to go back. This is archaeologically the oldest site that we know about, and it's from China. The site is Jiahu in the Henan province, and so with a burial of a woman, young 20, 30-year-old young female, there are these vessels, and these vessels contained residue. Dr. Patrick McGovern, University of Pennsylvania, archaeometrist, kind of leading scholar in the world of ancient fermented beverages, noted scholar, and as I mentioned, many books. This one's Ancient Wine, if you're wondering, and there's other ones, Uncorking the Past. If you're into this stuff, go deep. It's excellent work. He's a scholar. I got to go present with him. I have to gloat just a bit. Because of the work I did in Milwaukee with, fermented beverages, and I did Ale Through the Ages, a series that is now kind of migrated up here, and I know Ross is here tonight because he's come and some other folks out there, perhaps, where we brew on stage and we recreate these old recipes, ancient, fermented, or modern, or historic in Green Bay's case. So this was in the American Museum of Natural History, where we got to present on kind of the ancient methods that Dr. McGovern's doing, using various types of, you can see, mass spectroscopy or spectrometry, stable isotope analysis, gas and liquid chromatography. What that is basically looking at residue and saying, what are the chemical properties? What could have actually been in those vessels? And so by doing that, you can then see what the recipe was, or at least kind of conclude what the beverage would have tasted like. Now, multi-use is probably a part of it, but in most of the cases, this was buried with this woman 9,000 years ago. So, oldest archaeological evidence, and he's doing this from his laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. Very nice guy, and wonderful to have Pat McGovern now kind of on speed dial when we're talking about some stuff, hopefully in the future. What I want to also now move forward in time and space from ancient Asia, Eastern Asia, to the Central Asian region of Iran and the Central Plateau of Iran. So north, you have the Caspian Sea basin, Persian Gulf, and then north of here is the Black Sea. Well, this is a crossroads of civilization. At the site of Golden Tepe, you can see before the Common Era, if you're wondering, BC, just think before Christ, but then add the E era, because we're kind of now realizing, well, there's many calendars in the world, and not everybody's as Christian. So we're archaeologically also, it's slow to adapt. But that basically means 5,500 years ago. These are tepes or tells. Tells you kind of heard about maybe from ancient Near East, ancient Israel. But tepe is basically the same idea. It's layers of settlements on top of each other for thousands of years. And archaeologically, they're fantastic places to start understanding occupation levels. So in some of these vessels, there's calcium oxalate. So here's a sherd, a broken piece of one of those vessels. And here is a microscopic image of those crystal structures. That is the quote-unquote smoking gun of ancient fermentation, calcium oxalate. And so basically that is this beer stone. So in fact, I think you're probably going to know about this and have to clean this stuff out. It ends up in pipes and you end up using caustic materials, but it's a biological byproduct of fermentation. So that is one of the ways we can understand what was in these vessels. And so using that science, this is my graduate research at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I get to throw this in there, which is always fun when I get to. I actually made this. This is an X-ray I took at the Milwaukee Public Museum. The original sort of using chemicals, submersive sort of chemicals to create an image in X-ray. And what you see is a bull, the shape of a zebu bull, which is a humped animal from this region of Central Asia. And what also you can see is though there are two vessels interlocking. So what it allows us to do is understand both, kind of the construction methods of these vessels. And there's over 100. And the site's called Amlash. And it's actually way up here on the Caspian Sea. Here's the Elburuz Mountains. And they likely were from burials. This is before the Shah was overthrown. And what we now have since 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so getting in there is very difficult, but these artifacts are here in the state, and I studied them for graduate work, and you can see they're decanting vessels. They're basically used for pouring likely wine and other things. So I did a whole lot of science. I won't get into the metric analysis, and some of that stuff, because that's in the graduate thesis research. If you're interested, we can talk later. But it is a fascinating insight into a formal culture that is decanting alcoholic beverages in the mountains of the Elburuz Mountains, south of the Caspian Sea, again, on this literal highway of genetic material, plants and animals and humans and other technology that comes with it, including ceramics. We're going to fast forward to Egypt, and on the continent of Africa, of course, you have to talk about beer, because really we would have no temple and pyramid to Khufu on the Giza Plateau if it were not for fermented beverages. That has been established. Not only that, but also bread, huge ovens. But at this site at Hierakonpolis is otherwise known as the City of the Hawk. And you can see kind of where it is in the Nile Valley, flowing north into the Mediterranean Sea. And so quite a ways up, but there are ancient roots pointing to brewing in this site, stratified site, but also you can see these are large clay vessels that have charred grain, and you can see what the actual types of material is. Emmer wheat, dates. So as you can see, grapes even, viticulture. So all the things you talk about or see in papyri and other documentation, even in iconography, is now bearing out archaeologically. So that's really exciting. I know there's not a whole lot of time, but I'm going to have to jump across, of course, the Pacific. Well, it depends on which way you're going, Atlantic or Pacific. But otherwise, South America to Peru. And in the mountains, the Wari people had a sophisticated technology for not only mass communication across the Andes Mountains, but also formal, likely religious, ceremonial beverage consumption that was otherwise known as chicha, that we think of today. Corn beer, maize beer. And on top of this mountain, at the very top, Cerubal, Peru, uncovered in 2004, not that long ago, basically a mountaintop brewery. And to get there, think about the water. Where would you get the water? You have to haul it up there. So there is something up there that they're also doing. Again, this is the case at Hierakonpolis. This is the case in Iran. This is the case across the world, that beer fermentation is basically the liquid that is ultimately the lubricant for ceremonial beverages consumption in societies that have religious or spiritual kind of connotations. Today, look at the Roman Catholic Church. Wine is your blood of Christ. I mean, what more sacred sacrament than, that even? So, it's no different in Cerubal in Peru, 1,000 years ago. What's so cool about this, and what archaeology does and allows us to see systematically, is the fragments of, is that seconds or minutes? Okay, good. But these are beakers. These are polychrome, basically goblets that were ceremonially thrown into the decommissioning of this brewery. For what reasons we don't know, but they burned it down and they left these shawl pins. So what that tells us is there was now also, it's not just men drinking chicha, it's, women that are also probably making it and spitting actually to create the beer. Enzymes in the mouth break down the starch in the corn, the maize, to create a fermentable sugar. And that's a common practice throughout the world. So that was a big part of certainly Inca Empire, and how they were able to grow that big is likely on the backs of young women that were literally enslaved to do this work. And so these shawls are often thought to be basically cast into the rubble. Industrial archaeology. So this is my last slide, so I can do this in 4 minutes. In Milwaukee, I came out of graduate school and I worked at Discovery World as their staff archaeologist and curator, which is right on the lake if you've been down there, by the art museum. And having the background in archaeology and in interest in fermentation, deep time, of course, what better place to study this stuff than Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for Christ's sake. And so by doing so, I ended up being there at the time they tore down the Schlitz Brewery, which at the time, in this was 2012, was the largest brew house that we know of on planet Earth, possibly. It's 10 floors, 10 stories tall. You can see here, this is when they're ripping out the guts. And so I got inside there and I was able to salvage some artifacts, and some of them are on display right here. So these are 3 spirographs from one brewing day in 1970, June 9th. And it's a 24-hour brewing cycle. They are brewing round the clock. I think there was, if I count, I have to go back to the brewing plans. I was able to salvage a lot out of there before it went to the rubble pile. And I know architecturally they did save some of these, most of, I believe, the decorative ironwork. But there's amazing stuff that was I think, lost, of course. But almost the notes, the recipes of the Schlitz brewers. And I have even their time off requests. So, I mean, there's some stuff there that is like literally was just left on the 9th floor. And I put it in a backpack and I was with my camera and I have hundreds and hundreds of photos. But these are just a sampling. I mean, I was up to the grain mills. I mean, the whole conveyor belt system of how they move that much grain to brew on the scale they did that reached literally the largest output of beer production on planet Earth. I mean, it was down the road. It's gone now. But it's an archaeological site, the brew house. They're hard to maintain or flip in modern day, urban development or redevelopment. So the lesson there is Pabst did it correctly. They didn't scrap the copper kettles inside what is now a very, very swank hotel. And if you get a chance, go down there. You can see the original copper kettles. So if you had the chance to see it before it was even developed, you would have been lucky because it was literally walking into an era of industrial scale production of fermentation that the likes of which we're still seeing, certainly in Anheuser-Busch and some other Miller, of course, Miller Valley. But the little breweries that came and went and on our landscape from Green Bay and beyond, you can kind of get into that history if you're interested, and some of those buildings might actually be related to this deep story of why we like beer so much. That's ultimately it, right? So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Kent. So we'll take questions, I don't know, whenever you want to do them. Do you want to do them now or wait?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Check. Okay, so we're going to do questions right now, as we always do. So throw up your hand. Feel free to ask on anything, and in the last 7,000 years relating to. There we go. Any questions right now offhand? We got a couple back there. Yeah, Benny.
Theory, you heard that question, yeah? Well, archaeologically, it's a question, right? Likely, it has something to do with, obviously the other world. So, spiritual world, wherever that's defined, likely that's in the sky. Think about it, anthropologically, it's up there somewhere. I don't know. Warrior people 1,000 years ago, they were a warring people. But they had a defined religious practice and obviously a formal architecture program happening too, that transported their ideas across the landscape. That's not unusual archaeologically. You see that in Wisconsin with the Cahokia people from St. Louis coming up to what is now, just west of Milwaukee, between Milwaukee and Madison, the site of Aztalan. Who has ever heard of that site before? Aztalan. All right. Formal architecture made of earthen mounds. It's the oldest, likely, formal city you would see in Wisconsin. It's over 1,000 years old. Native American. Those ideas are being brought here in a formal way and laid out along the Crawfish River. So were they drinking beer there? That's a good question. Nobody asked it, but I guess I'm going to say I would like to see if they were, because corn was being planted in formal ways. Horticulture was here, and what happens spontaneously is what happens around the world. This is the other thing. If you leave with nothing else, just remember that humans didn't invent fermentation. And Jill, maybe you'll mention this too, is that they basically discovered it in all of its forms, right? They just harnessed the way to create enough sugar that Saccharomyces cerevisiae and everything else that ferments the sugars into alcohol, they can control it in a way that is now a formal beverage and style specific, as you will hear later as well from Brian.
So they're making God beer, is what you're saying.
That's a good, it's God beer. I mean, it's the essence of who knows what their language. Again, this is one example of many around the world.
Another question. Okay, back there.
Early on in the slide, it was Godin Tepe.
Yeah.
It's so similar, and even geographically, not far from this other recent discovery, Göbekli Tepe.
Yes.
That also
Yes. Well done.
Civilization right now on record, and it was intentionally buried and has recorded history of. Well, actually, I don't know about fermentation, but.
No, you're right. Ceremonial sacred architecture in the mountains at Tepe in modern day Iran. Well, no, it's in Turkey. That was Turkey, but it's in the plateau, Anatolia. That's 10,000 or more years old. Yeah. Just going back to why I was invited to even go to New York, first of all, to talk with Pat McGovern, of all people, was some of the work I did in grad school, an undergraduate, I should say, in Madison, UW-Madison. So shout out to the anthropology program there, anthropological staff who are some of the best in the world, honestly, doing work there. So I was able to work with a Professor Price, who is studying and was working with other labs to study actually sites in Turkey. There were settlements of some of the oldest human settlements in the world, and it was a site called Çatalhöyük, if you've ever heard of that. I don't know, Casey. Çatalhöyük, it's about 10,000 years old as well. And it's basically like these formal homes all connected together, like in a block. And so what we were doing is looking through mass spectrometers, shooting it through like a plasma flame, and it would literally spit it out onto an Apple I computer. This was 1997, 98. And it was hilarious, but you'd hear this machine just like humming beside you in a plasma burner that's like hot as the sun, like throwing a chemical spray that then comes back as a color chart. So that's just basically how it works. And through that, you can then see where the chemical spikes are. So then you can start to put the puzzles together of, okay, what was actually grown then, what is seen elsewhere, and so on. So that's the archaeometry is the fancy word, archaeology of the chemistry, to then literally put a fingerprint on, okay, we can then do experimental archaeology and actually try to recreate what those flavors were we're getting close. You can never get accurate, right? We're so far from then and the genetic species that existed then. So, but that's, at least we're on the right trail to just understand how it was done.
One more question in here. Okay, right there. Yeah.
So you said that they didn't discover or they didn't invent
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so if humans didn't invent fermentation or alcohol, what did they do to at least maybe first observe it? So let me guess. I guess I'll finish on this because I think it's probably poignant. We don't know, of course. We would probably be guessing, but the likeliest candidate for sugars present in nature and water and wild Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast, or name your Saccharomyces, wild yeast floating around, which has been around since the dinosaurs. The most likely candidate is honey fermenting, right? Bees, apis. There's a hive in a tree falls over in a storm, water in said hollow of tree, human, probably not even Homo sapien. In fact, even earlier. Likely Homo habilis, you name them, they're still being found all over the earth. Discovered said phenomenon of nature, consumed it. Light bulb moment, right? It's like, I want more of that. I'm going to go look for that. So, we don't know, but it is a very interesting question of it's likely very part of our genetic, makeup as humans today, as a genetic species, which is not that old, about 250,000 years old compared to our early ancestors. But that brainstem, that synapsis moment of, I'm going to crack a beer right now and watch the Packers, is very old. So I'll leave it there.
Round of applause, please. Kevin Cullen.